Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Jean Fourie, and today we are talking about assessment accommodations. So assessment accommodations are ways that we modify, adapt, and change assessments for learners who have some kind of learning difficulty, and in particular for disabled children, children who have various different disabilities and various different neurodevelopmental learning needs. So an accommodation is an alternative method of assessment. We are putting in place something that will assist the learner in order to show their full potential, in order to show what they're able to do. These accommodations should be granted at any time during the learner's school, while they're at school. A learner with a disability should be getting the accommodations in assessment throughout as soon as their difficulties and their learning needs have been identified. Those accommodations should be put in place at the school. A lot of schools think that it is only for the final exams or for the matriculation exams, that they, once they have been granted, they are able to be put in place for all class tests and various assessments throughout the learners' grades that they're at school. And any learner who has gone through the process of a diagnostic assessment and has the valid application forms can be granted this accommodation. Generally, it is for learners who have special needs, special learning needs, and so these learners have a history of difficulty, they have a history or a medical record of some kind of problem that they have. And people often think that because a learner is getting an accommodation, that they will be advantaged over and above the other learners in the class. But this is not so. The accommodation is there to grant that person, that learner who has the difficulty, an opportunity to show what they know and to show what they are capable of doing. Because if we do not grant that accommodation, then that learner is disadvantaged because now they're not able to show their learning. So we will go through some of the detail that is around these alternative assessments, and so that you can get an idea of what they are. The purpose is to ameliorate and minimize the difficulties that are inherent in various barriers. And we know from our understanding of barriers to learning that there are intrinsic barriers, barriers within the child. For instance, being blind, being deaf, not being able to walk, not having your hand, being able to use your hands to write. Those are intrinsic barriers within the learner. We also know that there are various extrinsic barriers that can impact a learner's performance during an assessment, and these are things related to the outside environment. If the material is not there, or the desk is of the wrong size, or there aren't desks, if there's too much distraction or too much noise, various extrinsic things outside of the learner's physical body can also have an impact on the performance during assessments. So we put in place these alternative methods of assessment in order to accommodate in order to assist the learner to show their full performance. And they are carefully monitored so that the learner's needs are being met, but we still maintain the validity of the assessment process. And it is to help the learner with whatever barrier they have, and not to advantage them over the other learners that we put this in place. We understand from barriers to learning that often learners have more than one difficulty, and we know that barriers can be long-standing, so they can be permanent barriers that the learner is experiencing. For instance, someone who is blind might not be able to have an operation to correct their vision, and so it might be a permanent problem that they have. We also know that barriers can be acquired, so children can be in an accident, they can get some disease, there can be some damage, and so they then acquire a disability which they never had previously. And the Department of Education allows learners then to apply for some kind of accommodations. And we also know that some barriers are fluctuating, so they change over time. They sometimes get worse, or they sometimes improve. And the process of maintaining assessment accommodations therefore happens annually once the learner has been identified, to see if they still need those accommodations, or must the accommodations be taken away from them? Are they now able to cope with the work? Were they assisted, or has their condition worsened, and so additional accommodations are required? And we also know that a lot of barriers are intermittent, so they happen once off, or they might be temporary. A learner might have a broken arm, for instance, and then they need an accommodation with writing, someone to write for them during an exam, and so that is not a permanent accommodation that would be required. The paperwork required for getting an accommodation for learners has to be carefully written. There are applications to do. There needs to be records associated with the applications, and so they have to be motivated. One can't just, as a teacher, give learners assessment accommodations because you think they need them. There has to be a process in the school where the learner is referred to proper people who do assessments, and then write reports, and the applications go to the district, and they are followed up at the school level. So learners could get assessment accommodations for various different barriers. For instance, visual impairments, if there's difficulty seeing things on the page, we can give various accommodations for that. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing can get accommodations. Various physical barriers such as problems with hands and writing, and learners who have cerebral palsy, which affects one's motor development. It's a neural difficulty that affects the movement of the hand and the body. For various specific learning disabilities, and we know that learning disabilities have an impact on a learner's ability to read accurately and fast, on spelling and grammar and concentration. We can also look at assessment accommodations for learners who have severe anxiety disorders, so learners who are very, very anxious and worried, and a lot of children have test anxiety, so their ability to function within a normal test situation is compromised, and various different psychological conditions, so various phobias and fears, such as an inability to be in crowds can have an impact as well. ADHD, attention deficits, are very common in learners, and we can look at how one can assist learners with their attention problems, and various other less common syndromes, such as Tourette's syndrome, which comes with a variety of behavioral difficulties that make it problematic for the learner to be in the same space as other learners to write their exams, and various diseases where learners are very tired, such as chronic fatigue syndrome, and learners who are unhealthy, who have cancers and diabetes and so on. So we can put those, we can put assessment accommodations in place for a variety of different difficulties that learners might present with. There is also provision made by the department for ad hoc emergency arrangements. And ad hoc means that it's something that is not ongoing, it's something that's happened recently, or something that is not a permanent barrier. There are always learners who have difficulties with car accidents and sudden illness during times of exams. Various different kinds of trauma occurs, death in the family, various assaults. And then we know that for the matric exams, the district is often dealing with learners who are pregnant, and babies are due, and so exams need to be postponed and different arrangements need to be made. The medical conditions, diabetes and epilepsy, often those are long-term difficulties, and but they can also arise suddenly, and so we need to be able to assist those learners. And then anything where there has been, the child has been involved in some kind of illegal activities or criminal activities, and they are imprisoned or found to be in special care centers for learners who have criminal behavior. There needs to be specific ways of writing tests and exams for those people. And any learners, obviously, with all of these who are hospitalized and who are in care at the time of exams. Special arrangements can be made for all of these learners. So it is really important that teachers, the school-based support team, and the districts work together closely in order to assist learners who are presenting with different problems. So your school-based support team at the school is responsible for ensuring that the official application forms are filled in correctly with all the different documentation that is well motivated and very clear, so that the district people, the people on the district committee on their team, can easily understand what is required. Recent medical records need to be updated and given, and by recent, they generally mean within the last 6 months, because barriers fluctuate and change and get worse or better. So there is a time limit to the recency of the medical reports. And these can include doctor's reports and educational psychology reports from a counseling or clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist. And reports should also show if this is a barrier that has a long-term standing and that there is a history to this barrier, then the history should also be given so that they can see if there is improvement and how much this barrier is affecting the learner. And so there should also be history of any previous accommodations, assessment accommodations that were given, so we can see if the barriers worked. The accommodations, did they assist the learner or did they not assist the learner? And will the learner be able to show what they know by having the accommodations in place again? So all the reports must be recent, not older than 6 months, and there are a variety of people that can have input into the reports that are added to the application. There is always a specific procedure to follow, and the procedure generally starts with the classroom teacher who identifies that there's a problem and that the learner needs to have some kind of accommodation made for them, collects all the various evidence, has a chat with the school-based support team, finds out if there is previous history and records on the learner that are maybe in the learner's profile, and these things should be recorded in the learner profile, which follows the child from grade to grade, so that the teacher knows what the current teacher knows what previous things were put in place. And consultations with whoever is the legal guardian, the parents, the caregivers, and please keep records of all meetings that you have, because a brief record of the date and the time and more or less what was discussed will assist the school-based support team in order to gain the background and the evidence that they need in order to motivate why this learner needs an assessment accommodation. And then there should be a team discussion where the school-based support team schedules a meeting and calls all parties to the meeting, and they sit together and look at the evidence that is available and decide what the way forward is and what accommodations should be applied for. So there are a variety of different things that one can ask for, and I'm giving a brief overview of them here. One can apply for learners who are having serious difficulty with reading for the test or exam to be recorded, audio recorded, and so they either listen to the recording or they get their computer to do to read the text for them, or you can get a reader, an actual person who sits next to the learner and reads the script for them. That's quite a common accommodation that happens in special schools, because a lot of these learners have difficulty with reading. If the learner is having difficulty with their vision, but they're able to see and they're able to do some reading, the print of the text can be enlarged, and there are various ways to do enlarged print, where the font size is very much enlarged so that the learner can read can read it. And of course, someone who is completely blind will be assisted to learn Braille, and so they would need their tests in Braille. And the matric exams are always available in Braille for learners who are blind, and so they are accommodated there. And various assistive devices and special equipment, if learners need, if they've got problems with their hands, for instance, and they need to use, there are various things that help you called graspers, help you to pick up things and turn pages and use computer screens. Various, depending on the physical difficulty that the learner has, various different ways to help them to move around and to write the answers. And so these things are often happening in special schools where learners are taught during normal school time, and there are occupational therapists and speech therapists who will help to put these accommodations in place. An amanuensis comes from the word for hand, and so this is a scribe. It's a person who will write down the answers for the learner if the learner is unable to write them for themselves. One always tries to let learners do the writing of tests as much as they can for themselves without someone taking over or being there. But there are some learners that really cannot write, and that is an option for them. One can also apply to have a learner write paper in a separate venue. There are some people who are either too distracted or distractible or anxious or some kind of phobia, some kind of difficulty that they cannot write a paper in a general venue, or they have some need that is going to disturb the other learners, and so they can be put in a separate venue in the school somewhere with a separate invigilator. Then there is a very common assessment accommodation, which is a time accommodation, and this is where a person is given a certain amount of time extra per hour in order to assist them with either if they've got a severe reading problem and they're reading very slowly, or if they need to have a rest break. There are some learners who cannot write for, let's say, 2 hours in one stretch because of chronic fatigue or illness or diabetes, where they need to stop and maybe eat something and test blood sugar levels and so on. And so the additional time can be given either 5 minutes per hour or 10 minutes per hour. In very extreme cases, there might be 15 to 20 minutes per hour rest breaks given, and these are for usually for a specific reason. So they have to be motivated very carefully, because obviously it adds to the logistic problems of giving the tests and assessments, because now this learner needs to have a different time frame for doing the test. So those are that's a brief overview of the different accommodations that are available, and they need to be carefully motivated for that particular learner with that particular learner's difficulties. And then the school-based support team fills in the application forms, refers them off to the district. The district has a particular committee that sits, and their committee looks at the application and all the supporting documents and evidence, and if they are satisfied that this is a valid application, then they refer it to the Provincial Exam Assessment Committee, because it needs to have final ratification by the province, who will give, who has a way of recording all of these, because they need to know which learners are getting accommodations. They get a tracking number, and they get properly registered, particularly for the final matric examinations. So when it comes to the final exams for the matriculation, the accommodations are very carefully monitored, very carefully recorded, in order to ensure that the learners get these accommodations carefully done, and so that the learner is not advantaged in any way, and so that they are still giving a true reflection of what they actually know, because those final matric exams, the integrity of those examinations needs to be maintained, and all the people responsible, the invigilators and the school principal and the people who are running the exams, need to account for all the assessment adaptations and accommodations that are given to every single learner, and there is a record kept and proper paperwork done for each of those. So meticulous records need to be kept of each of the learners' accommodations that are given, and candidates register at the exam center, and all the data and applications and everything is well checked and well recorded to make sure that everything is correct, and the specific people who give the who are responsible for this have to sign to say that they have checked everything and the declarations are all valid, because we can't have the integrity of the exams compromised in any way. The school-based support team has quite a large role to play in assessment accommodations, and because they are looking at the entire school and liaising with the teachers and the staff about which learners need the accommodations, ensuring that the accommodations, whatever material is required, for instance, if there's enlarged print needed, that is there for the learner on the day, that they do the monitoring, checking that it all happens, and reporting back to the district that the learner was there or what accommodations were given. And all these decisions are recorded in the learner's profile, and we know that the learner profile accompanies the learner from grade to grade, and the school-based support team should ensure that those learner profiles are kept up to date and that they are filled in correctly all the time. And they generally take responsibility for all the logistics arrangements on the site where these accommodation exams take place. They will also be responsible for ensuring that on the actual day of the exam, that the particular learner settles down, that they understand the process, that they know what the task is that they have to do, they know the time allocation. If there is additional time given, they know when that time will be given and how it will be, what they need to do during that time. If there are any assistive devices such as recordings of tests, audio tapes, a computer, text to voice, voice to text that's being used, those that must all be in working condition and there for the learner. And they ensure that the forms, the declaration forms, are in place, because these need to be filled in and signed and recorded carefully. So it's a very quite an onerous process for schools, but it is a process that assists all learners to in order to be able to show their full potential and show what they're able to do. And I'm assuming that teachers who have some specialized training, such as the teachers in the neurodevelopmental learning needs stream, will be used quite extensively on school-based support teams in order to assist them with these processes. Okay, so that is assessment accommodations, and there is a very clear book and some guidelines which I'm going to go through with you briefly, but let's take some questions now.